All right, we're going to go ahead and get started, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today for our Human Rights in Practice event with Professor Surya Deva on the topic of the right to housing and corporate responsibility. Our event today is sponsored by the International Human Rights Clinic and the Center for International Comparative Law. We also have our usual co-sponsors, for which we're very grateful: the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, the Duke Human Rights Center at the Keenan Institute for Ethics, the Human Rights Law Society, and the International Law Society. And I'm also especially excited today to announce that we have two additional co-sponsors that work extensively on housing issues in our local Durham community: the Duke Law Community Enterprise Clinic and the Duke Law Civil Justice Clinic. So thank you for that co-sponsorship. I also really want to thank Professor Deva for being here today. I think we've been working on this visit for a little over 2 years since I first started here, given the long trip from Hong Kong and the very busy schedule of Professor Deva. So I'm very grateful that he was able to make this work. And thank you all for being here. Professor Deva is an associate professor at the School of Law of the City University of Hong Kong. He's also a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. His primary research interests lie in business and human rights, India-China constitutional law, and sustainable development. He's published extensively in these areas and has advised UN bodies, governments, multinational corporations, and civil society organizations on matters related to business and human rights. He's one of the founding editors-in-chief of the Business and Human Rights Journal and sits on the editorial advisory board of the Netherlands Quarterly of Human Rights and the Vienna Journal of International Constitutional Law, as well as the Australia Journal of Human Rights. Professor Deva is an elected member of the Executive Committee of the International Association of Constitutional Law. And today we'll be discussing the responsibility of both states and corporations in relation to the right to housing, especially in the context of privatization and financialization of housing. Please join me in welcoming Professor Deva.
Thank you, Anna, for a very kind introduction, and very good afternoon to all of you. So in today's talk, I'm going to make two very simple arguments. My first argument is going to be that in this free market economy that we have, human rights are becoming commodities. So this is commodification of human rights, and I will try to show this in relation to right to housing. My second argument is that this commodification of human rights is inconsistent with international human rights obligations of states as well as the responsibility of private sector corporations. And again, I will refer to some of the private law instruments to show that. So let us get going with this. And I understand I was advised that I should cover a little bit of the basic as well. So I'll start with a little bit of basic in terms of what is a right. And I think this question, what is a right, can you see or I'm obstructing anyone? Sorry for that. So I think the question of what is a right is quite critical, because if we consider housing as a right, then it generates some binding obligations on the part of duty bearers, whether these are the governments or the corporations. On the other hand, if the housing is merely something which you may have and something which the government may provide or not provide, it's a discretion, it's a charity, then it has different implications. And I think that's why this issue of whether housing is a human right becomes quite critical. Now, as you may know, right to housing will fall under this basket, if we can call it baskets, of economic, social, and cultural rights. And as you will know, there is this traditional distinction between civil and political rights, which are considered sometimes the first generation rights, and the economic, social, economic, and cultural rights. And I think the distinction also becomes relevant, especially in a country like the US, which do not consider, at least many scholars in the US or the government in the US, they may not consider economic, social, and cultural rights as rights. Or even if these are rights, they are not justiciable. So I think that issue is quite relevant. But of course, if you take this issue from the international human rights perspective, these are very much rights, and many countries have also made these rights expressly justiciable. So they are as good or as bad as civil and political rights. And I think that issue is, again, quite fundamental. From my perspective, and from the perspective of international human rights law, the UN system, all these rights are of course universal, and I will not talk about this. But I think these other variables that you see here, the last three elements, they are absolutely critical. These rights are indivisible, because if the rights are not indivisible, then a country like China, where I live, may claim that what matters is economic and social rights, and civil and political rights can be put on the back burner. We need to develop fast first. On the other hand, a country like US may claim that what matters is only civil and political rights, and economic and social rights can stay, or these are not rights at all. And that's why from the UN perspective, from the perspective of international human rights law, these rights are indivisible, and I think that's how we should treat them. The other element that you see here is the interlinkages. They are interdependent and interrelated. Let us take right to housing as a concrete situation. Now, if someone does not have adequate housing, this will undermine right to privacy. I do not expect any person who is living on the streets in the US to contest the election for the President of the United States ever. Very unlikely. So if you do not have access to adequate housing, this is going to undermine other civil and political rights as well. And the vice versa also applies. And that's why these interlinkages are absolutely critical. And I think that is the point I wanted to make. Now, of course, these are the rights on paper, and reality all over the world is far from very good. As per the UN estimates, over 1 billion people are living in slums all over the world, which is about 13-14% of the total world population. It's a significant number. And we're talking about now 2020. This is a very recent estimate done by the United Nations. And that's why, in terms of the reality, I wanted to pick some concrete examples, and I picked three situations. I start with Hong Kong, where I live. So in Hong Kong, I don't know if you have been to Hong Kong, but Hong Kong provides a complete paradox. So in Hong Kong, you have rich bankers who are spending $20,000 just on rent per month. On the other hand, in Hong Kong, you can see these cage houses. So you have one room, and in this one room, these are the small places, maybe 16 square feet or 20 square feet, and you rent it for a month for about 200 or 180 to 200 US dollars. So that is the extreme paradox we're talking about in a city like Hong Kong in terms of right to housing. So that is my first example. The second example I picked is from India, from where I am. And again, you can find millions of people in India living in slums. And this is the aerial view. So you can see this. This is a slum, and you see these nice houses in the vicinity, you know. And that is the contrast, again, you can see in many cities in India. My third case study is the US. Now, in the US, again, homelessness is a key issue. It may not be as dramatic as in some other places or other parts of the world, and perhaps it is not as bad in this particular state of North Carolina, but it is definitely an issue in some other states like California and New York. I understand his situation is very, very problematic. I think we also need to understand the nature of the issue, and as per this data which I got from the website, the current estimate is about 500,000 people are not having any adequate housing, and that's why they are homeless, classified as homeless. But I think what is also crucial, and I will come back to this point, is that whenever we talk about rights or any impact, the impact is not felt by all of us in the same way. All of us have human rights, but when we get impacted positively or negatively by any activity of a company or activity of the government, the impact that we feel is very, very different. It will depend upon our racial profile, religious, it will depend upon the age, sex, disability, sexual orientation. So these intersectionality elements are very, very critical. So in the context of the US, again, this data gives an indication that who is suffering more. So not everyone is impacted by this issue of homelessness in the same way in the US. And I think that is a consideration, as I will talk about, should be taken into account both by the government here as well as by the companies. So in short, what are we trying to talk about here? My argument is that in this free market economy, in this globalized world, in this capitalist economy that we have, and of course there are challenges that we are facing all over the world in this, human rights have started to become a commodity. It's not merely about housing, it's about education, it's about health, and you can also look at civil and political rights. Let us say right to information, right to privacy. If you look at the big data, the companies are making millions of money because of the information you're sharing on social media. If you want to speak up, of course Twitter is free, but your voice may not be heard if the algorithm is not working for you. And that's why the rights are increasingly, not just social and economic rights, all human rights are increasingly becoming based on who you are, how much wealth and the power you have at that particular point of time. So this idea of commodification of rights is highly problematic, and businesses, the private sector, is of course exploiting that for the profits. In the context of housing, this idea of gentrification, I'm sure you're aware of that, is also problematic, because what happens is you have a particular suburb or a neighborhood which you would like to develop. And there's nothing wrong with this idea. But the point is, after this redevelopment project, it is quite possible that the people who used to live there may not be able to afford that accommodation anymore. And that has a negative impact again on right to housing. So those implications, and this is something which I just took The Economist this month. They carried a story, and this is the data which is quite relevant for us. And they're talking about last 20 years. So in 1990, for instance, it was about 100, and they're seeing how this pricing has gone up. So it is around 150 plus now, maybe around 160. So in the last 20 years. But I think if you look at more historically, you can see that I would say around 70s onwards, 70s, 80s onwards, I think this is a big jump is taking place here. Here, it was not that much. The price was going up. So I think that also goes to this idea of liberalization, free market economy. As it becomes more and more prominent, the private sector is getting more and more critical role in the economy all over the world, including in the US. You will see that this is becoming more and more unaffordable, and it's becoming a key issue. Now, in terms of international human rights standards, as you may know, we have this international covenant on ICSCR, and 11.1 article talks about housing, standard of living. Of course, other elements are there, but what is crucial for us is the housing. Now, as you may know, ICCPR, which is dealing with civil and political rights, and ICSCR, which is dealing with economic, social, and cultural rights, there is one critical distinction between these two conventions. Because here we're talking about the progressive realization of these rights. We cannot achieve a satisfactory level of housing, education, and health for everyone tomorrow. But what is expected is that the governments come up with a plan of action, and they try to achieve those goals in a systematic manner, in a periodic manner, and they invest, they allocate their resources to achieve those goals which are measurable, and I think that is something which is quite relevant. Now, as you may know, in the UN we have this system of committee of experts. They interpret these instruments. So General Comment 4 is directly on right to housing, and this General Comment 4 expands and elaborates what right to housing means. And they have identified these elements in this particular paragraph here. But I would like you to take to these 7 elements. So when we talk about what is adequate housing, as per this committee of experts, and this is not a binding international law, but this is highly persuasive because these are the experts making these recommendations to all the governments all over the world. So these 7 criteria or the elements are absolutely critical here. Of course, the security of tenure is there. So if you're going to be thrown out of your housing after 2 years, that creates uncertainty. Merely having a house is not enough if you can't get water and electricity there, right? So the question of services is crucial. It has to be, of course, affordable. The question about location and accessibility is quite relevant. If someone is working in a city like Durham and the person has to travel for 3 hours every day, then you may have an adequate housing, but is it going to be considered satisfactory as per these criteria? And of course, the cultural diversity is quite relevant. So depending upon which country we are, I think those elements have to be also taken into account when it comes to the adequacy of the housing. Now, when we talk about the obligations of the states, as you may know, the tripartite obligations are there. So the states have to respect, protect, and fulfill all the rights. Now, what does it mean in the context of right to housing? So when it comes to respect, of course, the governments have to ensure that they themselves do not adopt legal frameworks, policies, tax regime, which is undermining right to housing in the US. When it comes about the protection, the governments have to ensure that the companies operating within the territory and jurisdiction of the US, they do not violate human rights, including the right to housing. And finally, the fulfill element is also relevant because there could be some people who cannot afford it. And then that's where the role of the government to assist those particular individuals in society is going to become quite relevant. Now, of course, as you may know, US has not ratified ICSCR. With due respect, here, as you may know, US doesn't have a very great record when it comes to ratifying international conventions, right? So they should not come to you as a surprise. Then the question, and also if you look at the US Constitution, it does not explicitly recognize right to housing, right? Because there are some constitutions in the world which expressly recognize now right to housing as a right, as a fundamental right, as a constitutional right. So in the US, you do not have those options. So what else can we do? Where can we hook this argument that there should be some obligations for the US government? I think what the UN experts, including the UN working group of which I am part, what we have tried to do is we look at those international conventions which the US government has ratified. So this convention CERD, as we call it, racial discrimination. So if the policies of the US government about housing indirectly or directly discriminate against certain groups in society, this will be regarded as a breach of this convention CERD. Similarly, we can rely on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So if the policies on housing are disproportionately impacting children in the US, then that could be regarded as a violation of that particular convention. So even if the US government has not ratified ICSCR, there are other instruments that the government could be in breach of. We could also make a reference to this Charter of the Organization of the American States, which expressly talks about adequate housing and requires all the states to devote utmost efforts to realize this for all sectors of population. Now, we can also look at some soft international standards, and I'm sure you're aware of Sustainable Development Goals, right? So there are 17 goals, and these are the goals which are agreed upon by all the countries. These are voluntary commitments made, of course, but there's a peer review process which takes place in New York every year. And if you look at this target 11.1, it clearly talks about right to housing, which is safe, adequate, safe, and affordable housing, which is a key component that this goal has to be achieved by 2030 by all the states, including the US government. Then we can also refer to UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. These principles were adopted in 2011 by the Human Rights Council. These are soft standards, and our working group has a mandate to work with all the stakeholders to get these principles implemented. Now, these principles, of course, talk about the responsibility of private sector, businesses, but what is crucial is that they also focus on the state duty to protect human rights. And the US government is a supporter of UN Guiding Principles, so even if we do not have binding international convention applicable here, This document, a soft law instrument, applies to all rights, all international rights which are recognized, and the right to housing will be covered here. So US government under this Pillar 1 will have a duty to protect in a way that the companies operating in the US do not do anything which results in violation of right to housing. So these are soft standards which are relevant. Now let me talk a little bit more about the UN guiding principles because that is also the primary instrument with which I deal with in my UN role. So these standards, what is crucial is they talk about independent and complementary responsibility of businesses, all businesses, anywhere, operating anywhere in the world. Big or small companies do not matter, sector does not matter. All business enterprises, including partnership firms, they are subject to this human rights responsibility. Now, of course, there's a distinction here between duty and responsibility. So these are not legally enforceable duties. This is a human rights responsibility, but as I will, if there's time, I can explain that increasingly, even if this is a soft responsibility, because of litigation in many jurisdictions, including US and Netherlands, they are becoming, in practice, binding responsibilities. Now, a company and a business may cause adverse impact on human rights in different ways. The most severe could be it can cause that impact, but there can be other situations the company may contribute to adverse impact. Let us say we have a bank, and this bank is giving a loan to build a particular housing estate, and that housing estate is not built by the bank. Bank is merely providing the loan. And if the policies of that company discriminate against some communities, or it does not provide affordable accommodation, then this may be a contributing situation. And the third possibility is directly linked with something. This could be supply chain issues. So if a company is somehow linked with the services and the products in relation to right to housing, then this responsibility may again be triggered. Now what is crucial is that when we talk about the states, the obligation, the duty is tripartite: respect, protect, and fulfill. When it comes to corporations, it is only about respect. So we are not expecting companies to protect and fulfill human rights as per the UN guiding principles, merely respect. So it's basically a negative responsibility. They do not do anything which will undermine right to housing in this particular context. But of course, if you do any adverse impact, then you should address it. And that would also be a possibility of providing remediation, some kind of a remedy that you should provide. Guiding principles expect each and every company to do three things. They should make a policy commitment that we will respect human rights. The second is that they should do what is called due diligence. But this is not a due diligence typically companies do. This is a human rights due diligence. They have to consider the impact of their operations, their decisions on the human rights, all human rights on any member of the community who may be impacted. And finally, they have to provide for remediation. Now, if you look at this idea of due diligence, I do not have too much time to explain, but I just wanted to mention it has four different steps. And the starting point is to find an adverse impact. Let us say we have a company, and the company is about to start a new project about housing. So then the question is, let us say gentrification is the new project they have to do somewhere. Then the question is how this project is going to create positive as well as negative impact on the community around us. They should make this assessment. It's kind of a balance sheet because every business activity is going to have an adverse impact. Now the question is, how can we minimize the adverse impact and maximize the positive impact? That is what we are looking at. Once you know the impact, then you should try to integrate those into your decision-making processes. So the board of directors, for instance, the business managers, they should consider those findings. And once you have that integration, you should be tracking the responses because you cannot solve the problems immediately. So you may be able to fix something immediately, then some could be medium-term goals and long-term goals. So if your goals are medium and long-term, you should be tracking the effectiveness of your steps And then you should be communicating this to the members of the community. People should know what you have done and where you want to go in terms of addressing those impacts. So I think that is what the expectation of UN guiding principles is in relation to human rights due diligence. Now my final part is about this case study. I in particular wanted to discuss this Blackstone, which is a US company. Have you heard of this company? Yes. Okay. Now this word black, as you may know, there are several companies. You may have heard of Blackwater. So somehow these companies are interesting. Blackwater in the past, Blackstone. Have you heard of BlackRock? So these companies are interesting companies, very powerful, very big, and of course they are impacting human rights in different ways. So what happened in this particular case? Last year, UN Special Rapporteur on Right to Housing. Do you know what are the special rapporteurs? So these are basically like, I am a professor in Hong Kong, I teach law. UN doesn't pay me, so I am an independent expert advising UN states and all stakeholders on matter of my expertise. So we get appointed by the Human Rights Council for a period of 3 years. And that can be renewed for another 3 years, 3 plus 3, 6, and that's it. So we pro bono work for the UN as independent experts on a particular domain. So we have the expert on housing, and our expertise is business and human rights, that how companies can impact human rights. So we came together and we issued this communication. We call it communication in the UN language, but basically these are complaints. But because as you know, UN is very diplomatic things, so it's, the word is communication, but basically it's a complaint. So someone writes to us, they complain about the behavior of a government, a company, and then we write this communication to the relevant governments as well as the company. So we wrote this letter to Blackstone as a company, but we also wrote these letters to the relevant governments in the US, we wrote it to Sweden, Spain, some other countries where this Blackstone company has significant operations. Now let us talk about, again I will not have time to go through the details, but I quickly want to highlight what are the key issues that we highlighted in our letters. We basically wanted to say to the US government that you provide tax breaks, nothing wrong with that, but those tax breaks are creating incentives for some investment companies like Blackstone to buy these houses and then rent them out again. And that is problematic because poor people may not be able to afford houses then. The other issue is about subsidy. Tax breaks are given, but who is getting the most benefit of these tax breaks? And it's the rich people who are able to save more money on that. And of course, the rent control is an issue. And what is the responsibility of the federal government? So we believe that the federal government should at least encourage the states, because it's a federal system, but they should have this leverage to encourage them to enact appropriate rent control legislation. And of course, I already mentioned to you that the impact on rights, including right to housing, is not felt by everyone in a similar way. So we have some evidence to indicate that the housing policies affect some people more. And that's why the government should be sensitive to that. In terms of the company, we highlighted again a number of issues, but what is problematic is that they are considering this merely an investment. For them, the idea is how can we invest in housing and make more money? How this may impact on access to housing, how this may impact on adequate housing, that is not their concern. And of course, sometimes they will buy houses in neighborhoods where they could be undervalued. They will buy those properties at a very discounted price. They will invest something, refurbish them, and then they will rent it out again and make tremendous amount of money. Now, there's nothing wrong because that is the very nature of doing business. But the point is that if your decisions, your policies are significantly causing adverse impact on right to housing of those people who were used to live there, that is a concern for us. And of course, there is an issue about the leverage and the donations for a particular campaign. And in particular, we highlighted this Proposition 10 in California, and they invested millions of dollars so that this Proposition 10 loses out. Because this proposition basically was about that the California should have more effective rent control legislation. So that is again something we find problematic. Now, I wanted you to look at the website of this company, this is screenshot, just to get you a sense of it, what I'm talking about. Now, if you look at this opening introduction to this firm, what is quite telling is that this is an investment firm. So why are we writing to this? So we are not writing to a company which is doing the housing business. Are you getting my point? We are writing to a company which is claiming itself to be an investment company. And that is where this commodification and financialization of human rights becomes crucial. Because they are investing in housing as an investment asset. For them, it is about making money. The second point I would like you to pick from here is that they're talking about making a long-term value for the investors. They're not even mentioning, even for the sake of window dressing, the stakeholders. They're very blatantly saying, we are here to make money for the investors. There's nothing wrong with that. But many companies, if you look at their website, they will at least put it on a glossy paper on the website that, okay, we are looking at all the stakeholders. In the US, you may have heard of last year, the Business Roundtable, about 200 leading chief executive officers, they issued a statement last year. They call it the purpose of a corporation. Have you heard of that? So Google it. I don't have it in my slides. The purpose of a corporation. Now this statement is talking about that the purpose, I'm sure you're doing corporate law here, right? And the purpose of a corporation or corporate law, you will think primarily is about investors. But this idea is changing very fast. Because the free market economy is not working for everyone. It is working for the top 1%, top 5%. It is free for those who have money. It is not free for those who cannot enter the free market. So this idea of free market is absolutely misleading. Now, I also want you to very quickly look at the other screenshot from the same website of the company. And they talk about here on this screenshot the principles that matters the most. And you try very hard here, you don't find any reference to human rights or labor rights or the environment. Nothing about climate change. Right? So these are the issues that I wanted you to reflect. If you look at the code of conduct of this company, it's a 14-page document. And the word labor rights or human rights or environment do not appear even once in that 14-page document. So this company is there, and it's a very big company, and it is impacting right to housing, but this company does not consider those impacts as legitimate issues that it should be considering. And I think that must change. How could it change? And that's my last point. That we can do things differently. And like other governments, I think the US government has binding obligations under international human rights law, as well as soft standards like SDGs and UN guiding principles, that it has to adopt a rights-based approach to housing. I was looking at, we don't take political positions as independent experts, but I was, just for reference, I was looking at Housing for All of Bernie Sanders, one of the candidates for the Democratic Party. And he outlines some of the things that he would like to do to achieve right to housing for all. People can agree or disagree on that, but what I'm trying to highlight here is that a human rights-based approach to housing is crucial. A country like US, which has plenty of money and resources, cannot afford to have a situation where some people do not have access to housing. Because if they do not have access to adequate housing, this will have implications on rest of the rights as well. I think that is something which we have to understand. Now, in terms of taking policy measures and all this, they have to create incentives and positive incentives to promote responsible business behavior. That's very crucial. And of course, they have to give priority to those who need it most. And again, going back to the slides which I mentioned earlier, that some people may be impacted more. Now, what about the companies like Blackstone? I think, again, the crucial point is they have to consider, first of all, they have to understand this. And we sent them a letter They replied to that letter and we requested a meeting. We have still not been lucky to find a meeting with them. Hopefully, we will try to impress upon them during this meeting. But basically, the first step is for them to appreciate, understand that whatever they are doing, it has implications on housing and other rights. If they understand it, then they have to do the consultation, they have to do the impact assessment, and then they have to take their decisions in a way which are causing lesser impact, adverse impact on human rights. That is what the expectation is. My last point for now is that some of these challenges are very, very big. And that's why it is quite possible for these companies like Blackstone, instead of acting alone, they should come up with an alliance. Let us talk to all the companies. That is what social media companies are doing, right? So if social media companies want to do something in terms of policy framework, they come together. The banks want to act together, they come together. So we are inviting those companies who are impacting route to housing in an adverse way to come together to make this alliance and then move together in a particular direction which will achieve this right to housing, not just in the US, but also because these companies have footprints in many other countries in Europe. So it's not merely the adverse impact they're causing in the US. They're causing adverse impact in Spain, in Czech Republic, in Denmark, in Ireland, because we wrote these letters to several countries and several governments about the same company's footprint outside the US. And of course, I gave you the examples from Hong Kong, where the situation is extremely worrying in terms of housing. Of course, there are other worries about Hong Kong, and I'll be happy to discuss that after the talk. But I will stop here for now, and happy to take any questions and comments or any feedback that you have. Thank you very much once again. I can stay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the argument around discrimination.
Yeah.
And I think it's especially useful that often in domestic jurisdictions, to make a claim of discrimination, the intent to discriminate has to be shown.
Yeah.
Whereas with international human rights law, the impact is enough, and so that can be very useful. And there were a couple sentences in this complaint to Blackstone that I noted that were very interesting in terms of the impact on African Americans.
Yeah.
So for example, you say that one of the units of Blackstone penalizes late payment of rent by up to $100, even if the payment is late by 1 minute.
Yeah.
And also that in some states, the highest levels of investments by private equity firms are in communities that are over 70% African American. And so I think it's very useful for us to keep in mind how the framing of international human rights law that requires a showing of impact, either direct or indirect, but not intention, can be very useful in this context. So if you can say a little bit more sort of about the work of your working group in terms of emphasizing this discrimination argument, either in the US and I think you mentioned the Roma, in the Czech Republic as well, and some other contexts.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I mean, when it comes to international human rights law, the soft standards as well as the hard law, the intention is irrelevant. So what is crucial is whether a particular actor, it could be a company, it could be a government agency, it could be even other non-state actors. Like increasingly we see violations of human rights by terrorist organizations, right? So the question is, what are the human rights obligations of these terrorist organizations? Because they may also impact human rights. Companies can impact human rights, so anyone can impact human rights. So I think intention is not relevant. What matters is that what impact they're causing on that. And the impact could be positive, it can be negative. But what we are looking at is minimizing the negative impact, which could be direct, which could be indirect. In relation to the late payment issue that you highlighted, I think let us face it. So if you adopt as a company a very technical approach, the deadline is 5 p.m. to submit, let us say, the mortgage payment. And if someone is able to submit the payment, let us say, 5 minutes late, in my view, if you approach this issue from a human rights perspective, and there is a legitimate explanation, you don't see a pattern, that person submitting it late every week or every month, then I think that should be a good reason not to impose the penalty, because $100 could matter a lot for a family who is really working in a very limited and tight budget. It may not look anything for many others. So I think that question is quite relevant. So they should be sensitive to the rights holders, and being sensitive to rights holders, I think they should not be adopting a technical or an entirely legalistic approach to those particular issues. Of course, they are in the business of making profit, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what we highlight is make profit with principles. And that principles that we're highlighting is human rights.
I know you mentioned that you haven't yet gotten a meeting with Blackstone, but have any of the states which you communicated to responded?
Yes, all the states to whom we wrote letter, with the exception of the US government, have replied to us. And we have been able to have some bilateral meetings with some of those states. And Blackstone also responded to our letter. Of course, they reject almost everything we say, and they don't agree with us. They say they are already being part of the solution because they are doing something very positive, and if they have not done it, the situation would be worse. But our point is, yes, you are making that positive contribution, and we want to meet you. And there was an interest shown on their part for this meeting, but when we pursued it, no response yet. But we remain open because we don't have any power of sanction. So we have the power of persuasion and engagement. So we as UN experts, we engage with the governments, companies, all relevant state actors, and we try to persuade. And we have been able to persuade some companies and some governments. I will not name the company, but we have been able to persuade a very big South Korean company, for instance, who was exposing workers to toxic chemicals. And these workers were demanding compensation, and the company was taking a very legalistic opinion. Oh, prove it that because you are working in our factory, that caused you the cancer. What is the causation? So they were taking a very legalistic approach. So we had some meetings with that company, and we could persuade their behavior, and we could persuade the company to give compensation to those affected stakeholders. So we don't achieve our goals all the time, but we are doing what we can. I think there were a question here, right?
Well, so in a situation like you just described, what would be the remedy, particularly where you have this discriminatory impact? I'm not sure if you're aware, but in North Carolina, there's an outright restriction on rent control altogether.
Yeah.
Would there be some forum where people could levy a complaint, or I guess a communication to the UN to try to get, I guess, some sense of change from a state level, or is it just automatically based on the fact that the United States doesn't necessarily subscribe?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So we, as UN experts, we deal with this central or federal government. But of course, the complaint can relate to the mandate or the powers of the state government. That is quite possible, but we don't interact with the provincial or the state level. So if we send a communication, it will go to, that's how it works. So it will go to the US ambassador in Geneva, and then communication will come back to Washington, D.C., and then it will come to either different ministries at the federal level, or it may be sent to the state level. That's how it will work. In terms of remedies, we cannot provide remedies, but when people write to us, this may result in remedies. So I want you to understand that, don't have any misimpression that if you complain to us, we will be able to provide remedies, because we don't have the power of investigation. We do not have power to summon any documents or witnesses and all that, But if people write to us, that get a lot of media publicity sometime. If we issue a press release that puts some pressure, It might be taken up with some civil society groups and foundations. It might become a political issue in a particular country because we have highlighted it. So that's how we try to create this positive impact, which may work in a case or it may not work. There are also other avenues which I can talk about. I don't know if you are aware, there's something called National Contact Point. National Contact Point is established in all the OECD countries, and US is an OECD country. So all the US companies have to respect something which I have not mentioned, OECD guidelines. I'll be happy to provide more information to you if you are interested. And then you can formally make a complaint to the US NCP about the behavior of this company as well as the US government. So that option is definitely there. US NCP, you will not be surprised again, has not been very proactive in taking those complaints. But there are peers that the Dutch NCP is remarkable. They have taken really very comprehensive cases and able to provide some remedies against the companies. So it can be done. Yes.
I wonder, how did you persuade the company, the South Korea company that you just mentioned, to provide remedy to their employees? Because my guess with due respect would not be a human rights approach. I don't think that framing the issue in human rights, international human rights law, would be persuasive to that private entity. So, in face of corporations like them, what would you say to be the role of human rights?
No, I think we adopt, it's a very good question. We adopt a number of tools, but the UN guiding principles adopt a human rights-based approach. And we try to stress this point that all companies, especially the big companies like I was mentioning, they have human rights responsibilities. And I give you a concrete example. If a company has global operations, it is very likely that this company will be sued somewhere now for breaching human rights. This concrete example is Samsung. Samsung has been sued last year in France. For what? Because Samsung claims on its website, I quote, "We are the best ethical company in the world." So someone in France claimed, okay, you're claiming this on your website and you have child labor and you're exposing workers to many no unions in your factories, then how can you claim to the best ethical company in the world? So they are facing a case for deceptive and misleading advertisements, not in South Korea, in France. And they have been indicted for that. So those actions, there are small players who may not have a reputation, who may not care, and there could be companies operating in some states who may not care, as you rightly say. So this argument may not have that persuasive power for each and every company. Otherwise, I would not need to fly from Hong Kong to here to give this talk. If things were so easy, it will be perfect one. But we use a number of tools, and one of the tools is the human rights-based approach that we are trying to impress upon. Yes.
So my question is about the UN guiding principles. When you draft these things, they're meant to be universal, right? I mean, that's the idea. And especially when it comes to guidance for businesses, how do you square these principles with businesses like weapons manufacturers or tobacco manufacturers or businesses where it would be difficult, even in good faith, for them to make an argument that, you know, their products are consistent with human rights-based approch?
Excellent question. So these guiding principles were the starting point. So you draft these principles, and then we and other actors try to unpack them to the specific context. Like the OECD office has issued now the guidance for specific sectors. What does due diligence means, let us say, for the IT sector? What does it mean for the banking sector? What does it mean for the other retail industry, in the garment sector, for instance? So those guidance documents, I have not been able to refer here, but those guidance documents are available to elaborate these principles and other international standards in a more specific context. So that guidance is definitely available. But I think you also raised a very interesting question about, let us say, tobacco companies. And the question is that whether the business of some companies can at all be compatible with human rights law. I think that is, you do not expressly frame it this way, but if I reframe that question, I think that is a very legitimate question. And I'm fully aware of the history of Duke University and the Duke family, and I'm speaking on that premise here. But I think, in my view, it would be very difficult to justify that certain businesses can be done in a legitimate way at all and in full compliance with international human rights law. I think that is not possible. Same could be applied to some companies which are selling arms and ammunition in certain conflict zones, for instance, right? So tobacco companies, what they're doing? They're doing is, let us try to eliminate child labor in those who are picking leaves to make tobacco. And I think that's nothing wrong with that. But the point is, ultimately, your profit is dependent on to kill more and more people in the long run, right? That's what it is. And now, one tobacco company, again, I will not name it, they wanted to invite us to visit their new factories because they are innovating. They want to get rid of cigarettes, right? So they want to create something else, which they claim is not that harmful, is better for us. But we normally don't visit those factories because it will be a good opportunity for them to take pictures but I mean, this is a very complex field. Thank you. I don't know if any other questions. Otherwise, you'll get the second bite. I don't know if anyone else would like to. It seems no, I don't see any hands. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, I wonder, you mentioned that these companies would actually invite a UN special rapporteur to visit their site. What is the incentive of them to do so, aside from the previous financialization you already mentioned?
Yes. I mean, increasingly, what is happening is that Blackstone, for instance, they have faced a tremendous amount of negative publicity because of these letters. The media picked it up and all this. So what is also interestingly happening is that shareholders, which we call kind of more ethical shareholders, or some civil society organizations, they're buying shares in those companies, not to make money, but because they want to go inside the room where shareholders are there. So they want to get a resolution. So this shareholder activism is also growing in different companies in different countries. So companies are definitely aware of the risks that are increasingly arising to them. The risk could be about litigation. This is only one element of it. But they could be reputational risk. They could be a risk of, let us say, whether you, when you graduate from Duke, would you like to work for a company of that profile? So that could be a risk that they may not be able to attract the best talent. Of course, I don't believe that all of us are ethical on that terms. Some of us may be, some of us may not be. And I think that's again a value judgment. But there are a number of considerations because of which they would like to engage with us. They have their own motives. Sometimes the objectives of that company and our objective, what we want to achieve, would match. But sometimes it may not match. So whenever we are invited to visit a factory or any site of like that nature, we make an assessment, due diligence, that are we able to achieve something out of that, or will it become a marketing and PR opportunity for the company? If we think we are able to make some progress, then we will take the risk and let them make some PR out of us. That's okay. But if we are not sure that we will be able to achieve something in terms of the engagement and changing their policies and behavior, then I think we don't want to give them a free ride. Yes, please.
What do you think is the main barrier between working with U.S. entities versus other international entities? And would you say it's more like a problem of cultural autonomy or more of a stress or a value of corporate investment?
No, I will not say generally that it is more difficult to engage for us with the US entities. Like there are other companies, not Blackstone, but other companies, including mining companies from the US, with which we have had meetings. So it's not, I will not be able to say in a systematic way that US companies are more difficult to engage. In fact, there are other countries and companies from other countries, I will say they're more difficult to engage. Yeah. Again, I will not name the country, but you can guess. There are some companies from a particular country, a big country, which are very, very difficult to engage. Not only for us, even for the communities. So, but we treat all states, all companies in a similar way, and we try to persuade them that it is in the long-term interest of those governments as well as companies to move in this particular direction. Because ultimately, the future of us as a planet, as a global community, is that if we cannot ensure inclusive and sustainable growth for everyone, things are going to collapse. And they are collapsing very fast. I'm sure some of you may relate to this, but some of us don't relate to this because we are living in our cocoons. But I travel extensively and look at the ground realities, and things are really alarming. Yes?
Yeah, just a quick question. So what do you think, why we are just artificially creating double responsibility? So for instance, if the corporation is violating specific right, we can bring the claim towards the state for violating its positive obligation of not preventing it.
Yeah.
So why we should have like double responsibility, one for corporation and one for a state? It will be an undue burden. And the second question is that while you say that it's really hard to persuade the governments and the specific states to like carry on their human rights obligations, why do you think that it will be easier to persuade the corporations, which are like most of the time, in like 90%, they're standing behind the governments?
Okay, two questions. Again, very good questions. So first of all, from my perspective and the perspective of the UN Working Group, we believe that not merely the governments, but any entity which can violate human rights should have human rights obligations, period. So it does not really matter whether it is the government agency or a public sector enterprise or a private company, does not matter. So we should be looking at not really who is violating the rights, but rather what is the impact of that activity on the rights. So if I'm a right holder and if I get discriminated, let us take a concrete situation. Many companies insist on pregnancy test before hiring women in their factories. So if these women are getting discriminated, does it matter to them whether it's a company discriminating against them or it is a government department discriminating? In my view, it doesn't really matter to the rights holders. And that's why we are not really creating a dual responsibility or obligation. Rather, we are expanding this traditional paradigm of human rights law in which the obligations were only on states. We are expanding the tent. And what we are saying is that anyone else as well, if you can violate human rights, then you should be under a duty. Now, of course, having said this, because these companies are operating from the territory or jurisdiction of a given state, then we cannot ignore the obligation, the protect element of the duty of that particular government. So the government has to do what they should be doing. But we should also be aware that this duty of the government to protect is not an absolute duty. They have to do merely what we call take reasonable steps. And the government may take reasonable steps and the violation may still take place. And the government, we cannot hold the government accountable. But the company can be held accountable even if the government cannot be held accountable. So that's why this independent responsibility may become relevant in those particular situations. Will it be easier or better to persuade the companies? I will say no. I agree with you. So, difficulty is it is not easy to persuade anyone in this today's world, government or company, to speak and walk the talk on human rights. Whether we are talking about democracies in the world or non-democracies in the world, or we're talking about companies in the world, we are facing a very significant challenge all over the world. But that's why we should knock at all possible doors. And there are some companies who are more progressive than some governments. So we knock at the door of those companies as well and try to persuade, and hopefully that will create this ripple effect, and more companies will understand and they will start doing something better. But it is a challenge. I don't want to leave you with any illusion that it is a very rosy picture. It is not, unfortunately. I mean, I'm working in this field of business and human rights almost 20 years now. I keep fighting in whatever way I could, but I'm not very optimistic. But that does not mean that I will stop fighting. That's my... So as long as I'm there and I'm allowed to fight, I will fight.
I think we're actually out of time.
Oh, sorry.
Do you want to come up afterwards to ask your question? But thank you for ending on that pessimistic but also optimistic and realistic note.